This is the Energy Education Podcast for Sunday, December 9th, 2012. I'm Kevin Hurley. This podcast is a project of Fairewinds Energy Education. Fairewinds is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate policymakers, the public, and the next generation on matters of nuclear power and safety. Today on the show, global attention is back on Japan following an offshore earthquake measuring 7.3 on the Richter scale. We'll talk about this most recent quake. Also on the show, the Fukushima Daini reactor complex, only a few miles south of Daiichi, saw a rise in containment pressure during this most recent quake. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about difficulties TEPCO may have in removing the damaged fuel from the fuel pools. Joining us again this week is Fairewinds Chief Nuclear Engineer Arnie Gundersen. All coming. Thanks for joining us this Sunday. It's December 9th, 2012, and you are listening to the Energy Education Podcast. As a quick reminder, we do want to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments that you would like Arnie to address here on the podcast, we want to hear them. You can do that by making a short audio recording and sending it to us in MP3 format. The email address is podcast@fairewinds.org. Now remember to introduce yourself with your first name and location. All submitted questions and comments should be about 30 seconds or less. Again, the email address is podcast@fairewinds.org. Also this December, Fairewinds is asking for your help. We rely on the generous contribution from listeners like you to continue moving energy education forward. This season, please consider helping us to reach our fundraising goal by making a tax-deductible donation. You can do so by visiting the Fairewinds donation page at fairewinds.org/donations. Now let's get to it. Arnie, thanks for joining us here in the studio today.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for having me again.
Well, let's get right to the main topic of conversation, the earthquake in Japan that happened 2 days ago now. It was a 7.3 on the Richter scale, and everyone's concerned about Unit 4 and Unit 3 in Fukushima Daiichi. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, it was a 7.3, but it was 150 miles offshore. So that means that the site didn't experience a 7.3 earthquake. You know, it's like throwing a pebble into a pond. At the center, the blast when the pebble hits is bigger, but then as the pebble moves out, as the wave moves out, it's less and less high. So the site was hit by a significant earthquake, but I wouldn't call it a severe earthquake.
Probably not a 7.3 by the time it reached the plant, then you're saying?
Yeah, I'm sure it was probably on the order of a 6.
So what, even with a 6.0 earthquake, I mean, the buildings are unstable. It's still something to worry about. What did happen on site?
Yeah, I've been saying if there's a 7.0 on site, to worry about the structural integrity of the buildings. And I still believe that. Especially Unit 3 is the worst damaged building. And, of course, Unit 4 has the most nuclear fuel exposed. So there's a trade-off there. The most likely to fall is likely 3, but if it does fall, 4 would cause the more severe radiological releases. So, but that didn't happen, which is good news. The fuel pools are still intact. I don't believe that what Tokyo Electric said is true. You know, they said, don't worry, be happy, everything is fine. There's some indications of a problem in Unit 1, where this is that Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1, where the hydrogen gas started to increase after the accident. It's still not at explosive levels, but it's gone up dramatically. There was another problem down the road, 5 miles down the road, at the Fukushima Daini site. And that one, in their Unit 1 there, they experienced a pressure increase inside the containment. No one's quite sure why that happened, but it was shortly after the earthquake, so it's certainly a causal effect. And then Nikkei, the news service, is reporting that at the fuel processing plant, which is nowhere near the center of the earthquake, there was also a spike in radiation releases. So, these are problems that shouldn't happen, but they're not catastrophic.
Mm-hmm. So Unit 4 is still standing. Everyone's big concern was Unit 4. Should people be worried at this point about the Fukushima site in Unit 4 specifically?
Yeah, you know, I am still worried about the Fukushima site. And this earthquake, 7.3, is likely not the biggest that can happen as an aftershock to the 9.3 that occurred. The example is if you go back to the Sumatra earthquake in 2006 or 2007, that was a 9, and then about 18 months afterward, there was an 8.6 aftershock. So a 7.3 aftershock after a 9.3 earthquake certainly would be expected, and frankly, I think there'll be a worse aftershock sometime in the future. It's just a question of predicting when.
Arnie, we've been talking about Unit 4 and Unit 3 for quite some time and what threat they might pose to Japan in the event of an earthquake. For the new listeners, can you just kind of go over that one more time? Why do we really have our eye on Unit 4 and Unit 3?
Yeah, Unit 3 and Unit 4 were the most compromised structurally from the accident. The explosion in Unit 3 severely damaged its structure on top of the fact that it was hit by earthquakes and aftershocks. And the explosion in Unit 3 also damaged the structure over on Unit 4, plus the fact Unit 4 had its own explosions and earthquake and aftershock. So those two buildings are the structurally the weakest. The tension on Unit 4 is compounded because there's so much more nuclear fuel in the fuel pool at Unit 4. Unit 3 is still has a lot of fuel in the pool, but in comparison, Unit 4 is worse. So that when you look at the trade-off here, it's the Unit 3 is more likely to collapse, but the consequences are less. Unit 4 is a little bit stronger, but the consequences are much more severe.
And those consequences are?
We'd be back to March 11th, 2011 if Unit 4 were to collapse. You know, it would bring the country to its knees again and cause massive evacuations and potentially become a global issue as well. It depends on the fire. We're dealing with a fire that no one's ever seen before. You know, these fuel pool fires are postulated. And we showed the video of a lab, national lab, demonstrating what a fuel pool fire would look like. But no one's ever done it, and hopefully no one ever will. But the amount of radiation here is equal to the amount of radiation that went up in all 700 nuclear above-ground tests for 40 years in one fell swoop. So it could be really serious.
Well, that's a lot for the Japanese people to be thinking about every time the ground shakes.
Yeah, you know, that's important to that the Japanese government really needs to internalize this. They had Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the country got over it. They bought into the nuclear premise, even though they were bombed and they had the black rain. And they believed and they trusted authority, but it happened. It happened again at Daiichi. And, you know, rather than those being bookends on the nuclear industry, you know, it began at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and could end at Daiichi for Japan. The Japanese government is now talking about doing it all over again for another 40 years. And you got to think about every time the earth shakes now, what are the Japanese going to be thinking? They're going to be thinking, oh my God, it can happen again. And it can. I mean, Japan is on the rim of fire. And it only has a little tiny piece of landmass. It's only 0.5% of all the land on the planet is in Japan. And yet they get 10% of all the earthquakes on the planet. So it's not a great site to locate nuclear power plants. And on top of that, the 0.5% of land that they've got is largely mountainous that nobody can use, which forces everybody into the coasts. And of course, that's exactly where the nuclear plants are as well. So the island is a bad test case for nuclear power in general. And you've got a sensitized population. And I don't think that's going to go away. I honestly believe that every time the ground shakes for 40 years, if there's a nuclear plant running, the people are going to just hold their breath and say, oh, my God, I hope that the OE plant or whatever rides it out. That's a difficult psychological place to put your population. And I think the Japanese government is just not anticipating 40 years of stress on their population if they continue to run these nuclear plants as they're proposing.
Arnie, earthquakes in general, measured on the Richter scale, my understanding is that this is an exponential scale. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, you're right. It's not quite exponential, but it's darn near. And what that means is that the difference between an 8 and a 7 isn't 10 times or once or whatever. It's 30 times more powerful. So, let's look at this 7.3 versus the Sumatra 8.5. That's about 40 times more powerful. So the aftershock at Sumatra was 40 times more powerful than the earthquake that Japan just experienced 2 days ago. And that's an aftershock. So we have to keep in mind that when you hear a Richter 7 compared to a Richter 8, that it's more than 10 times more powerful. On top of that, though, is the location of the earthquake. So when people heard Earthquake Japan, they automatically started calling and emailing Fairewinds, but they didn't look at where it was, which was 150 miles away. So the ground acceleration of Fukushima Daiichi looked to me to be a couple inches compared to feet like in the previous earthquake. But what that means is I'm sure that components that were already damaged fell. They'll go back in that building, and things that were hanging on the ceiling are now have fallen on the floor. They weren't usable before, and now they're certainly not usable. But it's almost like after a hurricane, you get a lot of tree limbs that are still stuck in the trees. Well, the next storm that comes through, those tree limbs come down. So the same thing is going to happen in each of the Daiichi units. They're going to see damaged components get more damaged or in fact, fall to the floor.
So while this most recent earthquake at the Fukushima Daiichi site didn't take down any buildings, it certainly doesn't make the problem any easier for the TEPCO workers and for the government workers to deal with. Moving down a few miles south, is the Fukushima Daini plant. You just spoke about a increase in pressure in the reactor following this earthquake. Can you talk about Daini, though, 2 years ago? What happened to Daini on the March 11th, 2011 earthquake?
Yeah, we talk about it extensively in the video that's on the site. The video that was called "It Could Have Been a Lot Worse." We talk about the loss of the ultimate heat sink, and the tsunami that knocked out the Daiichi cooling pumps also knocked out a lot of the cooling pumps at Daini. Then there's about 6 mile difference between those two sites. In particular, the pumps that cool Unit 1 were destroyed, and the diesels for Unit 1 didn't work. That implies there has to be core damage at Daini Unit 1. And this is one of the big secrets that Tokyo Electric isn't talking about, is just how damaged is Fukushima Daini. They should also talk about just how damaged Fukushima Daiichi 5 and 6 are, but we're not hearing that either. But Daini went for a period of time with no way to cool it. It had no diesels because of this loss of the ultimate heat sink. And now in this earthquake, we see an increase in pressure in the containment. These things are related. I'm not saying it's catastrophic, but I am saying that I think the scientists in this scientific community need to get straight answers from Tokyo Electric. Let's not just look at Fukushima Daiichi 1, 2, 3, and 4. We need to look at Fukushima Daiichi 5 and 6, what happened to them, and then the Daini units as well. I think Daini 1 is going to have core damage, and whether or not Daini 1 will ever start back up is a question that should be asked by energy planners, and I don't hear that on the screen, on the radar screens of people in Japan.
Arnie, moving on, we have received a lot of emails lately about why TEPCO is putting covers over the fuel pools at the Fukushima Daiichi site. Why not just pull the fuel out as fast as possible?
Yeah, I've been reading those too, and this is a great opportunity to talk about that for a couple of minutes. I was in the business of building nuclear fuel racks. And if you think of nuclear fuel as spaghetti, well, then the rack is the box that the spaghetti's in. And if the spaghetti is straight and the box is straight, you can turn it upside down and the spaghetti falls out easily.